These narrow strips of ocean right here are crucial to Russia's economy and military, and yet they just so happen to be surrounded on all sides by Russia's main strategic rival, NATO, making them one of Russia's greatest strategic weaknesses. Welcome to Buried Origins. Today we'll talk about how Russia's reliance on the Danish Straits and the North Sea are one of the country's greatest strategic vulnerabilities. So let's get into it. So the Russian economy, and in particular the Russian government, is highly dependent on the export of oil. Roughly a quarter of all Russian government revenue comes from oil exports, and anywhere from a third to 43% of all Russian oil exports cross through the Danish Straits, which are only 2.5 miles wide at their narrowest point and are surrounded by NATO countries. Then those oil exports go through a second choke point in the North Sea, having to either pass through the English Channel or go around Scotland. In both cases, the ships are still being surrounded on all sides by NATO countries, in particular the UK, which has a very aggressive policy towards Russia. The closure of either of those choke points to Russian oil exports would put serious pressure on the Russian economy and the Russian government's finances, both already under significant amounts of stress from funding the invasion of Ukraine. So if Russia and NATO don't get along, why does NATO allow Russia to use its sovereign waters for its oil exports? Well, the quick answer is that maritime trade is protected under international law, and blocking it is a radical escalation that is often declared an act of war by the country being interfered with. It's still used against weaker states like Iraq and the Houthis in northern Yemen, but blockading the trade of a nuclear power like Russia is an incredibly risky decision, as it could lead to clashes between NATO and Russian navies, which might quickly turn nuclear, Russia having the world's largest nuclear arsenal, of course. And because population and government centers like Copenhagen are literally in the middle of the Danish Straits, civilians would be caught in the crossfire, making it a far riskier gamble than, say, a US blockade of the Strait of Malacca. But let's do a radical thought experiment and imagine for a second that these NATO countries decide to pursue a deniable form of blockading the strait, in effect exerting the same amount of pressure on Russia but denying it an excuse to start shooting at NATO ships. This is entirely a hypothetical scenario, just meant to demonstrate a strategic Russian vulnerability, and not in any way a prediction of the future. So, one possible form of blocking the straits while maintaining a veneer of deniability would be to allow Ukrainian special forces teams to operate from the coastlines surrounding the Danish Straits and North Sea, and start raiding and disabling Russian oil tankers. They could do this by actually boarding the ships, but a less risky alternative might be by using the Magura V-7 drone boats, the things that have allowed the Ukrainian Navy, which does not have ships, to effectively defeat the once feared Russian Black Sea Fleet. If they could safely target only the rudders of the oil tankers so that they disable them without causing an environmental disaster, then they could effectively stop the transit of Russian oil through either the Straits or the North Sea. Now, of course, Russia would try to employ its Baltic fleet to protect the tankers, but the Russian Navy has absolutely no effective counter to the Magura drone boats, which is why the remainder of their Black Sea Fleet has been hiding in its ports for years, often with chains dragged across the entrances for extra protection. The Russian Baltic Fleet would be an even more appealing target to the Ukrainian teams than the Russian oil tankers themselves. And if the Russian Black Sea Fleet's performance is any indication, these cheap drone boats would wreak havoc on the Russian Baltic Fleet, sinking multi-million-dollar ships left and right. In this scenario, Ukraine could take full responsibility, and given the fact that Ukraine and Russia have been trying their hardest to destroy each other's energy and economic infrastructure for years, and that Ukraine seeks any possible way to hurt Moscow's finances, it actually isn't that outlandish. What is outlandish is the Ukrainian teams basing themselves out of NATO territory, something that all countries involved would have to deny while obviously supporting them in reality. As far as deniable operations go, it would be pretty poor, about as obvious as when Russia sent troops into Ukraine in 2014 and denied it. Although in this case, the stakes would be much higher. Okay, so now in our scenario, the Ukrainian drone teams have effectively blocked either the Danish Straits or the North Sea to Russian oil exports. Well, you might be asking why Russia wouldn't just use its other ports and oil pipelines to export its oil. It spans 11 time zones after all. The answer is that Russia actually has very limited ability to ship the oil that's currently transiting the Danish Straits through other ports or through overland routes. When it comes to the Northern Sea route, Russia is expanding its oil infrastructure there, but it remains a small part of its overall export infrastructure, due to the fact that the route is seasonal and requires specialized tankers to navigate. And regardless, Russia is currently at its maximum capacity for those export terminals, so it wouldn't be able to replace any of the oil exports meant for the Danish Straits by using the northern route. With the Pacific, it's actually not possible for Russia to divert the oil meant for the Danish Straits to its Pacific ports via pipeline, because no pipeline exists between the two. The main Russian oil pipeline feeding its Pacific ports starts here, and is fed by Siberian oil fields. If it really wanted to send its Baltic-bound oil to the Pacific, it would have to do so via train, which is very costly and has huge logistical limitations. And there's no way for Russia to send the oil meant for the Danish Straits to its relevant customers over land. For instance, India is the largest buyer of that oil, but no overland route for exporting oil to India exists. So if the Danish Straits were closed to Russian oil exports, Moscow would have no viable option for sending that oil elsewhere. It would simply have to take a huge hit to its economy and to its revenue stream. It's hard to imagine Moscow would just accept this without pursuing serious retaliation against any country it thought was involved and leveraging its military power to make them back down. And then it's easy to see the cycle of escalation lead to nuclear war. If Ukraine was somehow able to launch its drone boats out in international waters in the Atlantic, then it could attack Russia's oil tankers while having some real claim to be the sole country involved in the attacks, and Russia would have no obvious NATO target to retaliate against. But the logistics behind such an operation would certainly be much larger, as the oil tankers would be more dispersed than in the chokepoints. So, in conclusion, while at face value the Danish Straits are a strategic vulnerability to Russia, once you factor in Russia's massive nuclear arsenal, that strategic vulnerability is mostly nullified, as it's unlikely NATO would pursue a direct military confrontation with Russia. But that's in today's political climate, and things can change quickly, as we've seen from the last few years. Russia's probably already been pursuing a campaign of sabotage in the Baltic Sea, attacking underwater energy and communication cables of NATO countries. So perhaps that campaign escalates to a point where NATO troops are killed, and in response, NATO pursues some form of blockading the strait. Or perhaps NATO blockades the strait in response to a Russian tactical nuclear strike on Ukraine, something that the Russian government has talked openly about doing. In these cases, NATO might even block the straits openly in order to publicly demand Moscow change its course of action. Things would have to be pretty drastic for all that to happen, but they're already far more serious than most would have predicted just a few short years ago. Well, I hope you enjoyed learning about one of Russia's greatest strategic vulnerabilities. If you did, please like and subscribe. See ya.